Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of the Security Middle East Magazine webinar. I am thrilled to be back and to be involved in this webinar today. It's covering a topic that's very close to home for me, myself, professionally. I think ransomware is one of the most talked about topics, I would say, in boardrooms and in cybersecurity strategies globally. And I think especially across the Middle East, as organizations in the region continue to digitize and continue to expand technologically, the threat landscape is becoming ever more dynamic. And ransomware is just one of the major threats that can impact organizations within the region. So having a robust resiliency strategy in place is something that's top of mind, not only for security professionals, but that is certainly translating to the boardroom. So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Pentera, who will be exploring how to improve security validation in proactively testing your attack surface. I'm joined today by Oren Kaplan, who is a distinguished security expert and Senior Director of Middle East and Africa at Pentera, and Shakel Ahmed, who is a cybersecurity engineering lead at Pentera as well. And they're going to be walking us through some of the tangible benefits of adopting a strategic exposure management framework to reduce ransomware risk. And then towards the end of the presentation, we'll be demoing the ransomware ready module that Pentera have developed. So I'm very excited to see that and to explore some of the core themes associated with resilience, crisis management, and ransomware readiness. So Oren, please bring up the camera. Be more than happy to pass over to you and to kick off the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. So first of all, thank you so much for coming this morning. Really appreciate it. And let's go through our exposure management program. All right, so the agenda for today, we have a very nice blueprint for you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about the frequency of testing, scope, a few assumptions that we all have in mind, how we rely on controls to actually help us in combating things like ransomware. I'm going to quote Albert Einstein, talk a little bit about the adversary mindset, move to Shack for a live ransomware attack using Pentera, talk about a few case studies, and summarize. So I'm going to start with a statement talking about controls. So security controls that are not validated will degrade over time. This is a pretty big statement. I want to take you guys to the world of aviation, right? We all just came back from Eid al-Fitr or Easter. We hopefully took our families or went on vacation to the beautiful beaches of Thailand, maybe the streets of New York. And really, when we flew on these on the aircraft, and I'm asking you, the people who are listening to this webinar, did you feel safe when you went on that aircraft and flew to New York, for example? Did you feel safe? So you probably did feel safe. Why? Because maybe you took a first class ticket and it was very comfortable and you had great food and the ambient lighting and the movie was pretty good. Or maybe you took a business class trip. Um, or actually, I think you were probably more safer because you knew that this airplane would land safely. And it was tested before you actually went on the airplane. So, but what if I would told you that this airplane was just tested on December 5th? Its controls were tested on December 5th. Would you still feel comfortable and convenient flying all the way to Thailand? I'm guessing probably not. What happens if you what happens if that airplane was tested for only the landing gear was tested? Would you still feel safe with someone who is testing only the landing gear? So not the entire airplane, but basically just the landing gear. Would you still feel safe flying on this aircraft? Guessing also probably no. What if I told you that there were 5 aircrafts that are the same? the same exact aircrafts. All of them are the same make, year, manufacture. And before you guys went on the plane, they tested a very similar aircraft to yours. And that aircraft was perfect. Their landing gear, navigation, everything was perfect. Would you still feel safe going on that aircraft? So basically, what we understand here is that unless we know as individuals that the aircraft or things that we are using constantly are being tested, we don't really feel safe uh, um, flying with them or boarding those aircrafts. And I want to move this analogy to cybersecurity, right? Because, you know, we have our networks, it changes dynamically, and we don't really test that network frequently as we should. We, in many cases, assume that one equals the other. We test one portion, and we believe that this would be the portion that would be kind of like detrimental to us. Now, I want to take this analogy to pretty much networking, right? The changing attack surfaces, right? If we look at the airplane, the more we test the aircraft, the less risk we basically have, right? If we know that the aircraft was tested 5 minutes ago before we boarded, we know that probably everything's working well. The landing gear, the navigation, everything's working well. Um, but what if we, but so basically the same thing for network. The risk level changes, right? Because there's always dynamic things that happen. There's new vulnerabilities, new misconfigurations, new ransomware attacks, new hosts are coming. So there's always a risk level associated with networking and with cybersecurity. Now, how do we lower that risk level? How do we create kind of like a mechanism that allows us to feel more comfortable with our cybersecurity and with our network? Now, in many cases, people look at simulations, right? How to simulate some sort of a testing kind of like environment. But would you fly on an airplane where you know that the pilot went just through simulations, for example, and not really flew a real airplane before? You probably won't. You want the real deal. You want someone that actually had flew on an airplane before and knows the pitfalls and actually what happens, in real life situations. Now, when we look at cybersecurity today, we basically see this kind of like, diagram where we see, the threat prevention on the left, where we invest a lot in controls that will help us detect and mitigate an attacker. And then, if God forbid something happens, like a ransomware incident or some sort of an attack, we need to start working on response. Now, we in many cases what we see with our prospects, they don't really take the proactive approach. They focus a lot on threat prevention, spend a lot of money there, and then boom, after the boom, they invest a lot in incident response, which can cost north of $500,000 just for a mere incident response and an investigation. Now, the way we basically invest in our controls, and according to a survey that we in Pentera saw, that um, and on average, each and every organization has around 40 security controls. So we're talking about the SIM and the SOAR and the EDR, the NDR, the Security Operations Center. So we basically um, invest a lot in prevention, like you've seen in the slide before. We invest a lot in prevention, and the question is, does this prevention actually helps us? Do we actually test those security controls that we invest in? Do we know that if an attacker tomorrow starts a ransomware attack, do we know that our endpoint security platform would detect and respond? Do we know that our security operations center will see that attack in real time and will be able to mitigate it? We don't know for a fact. We basically assume. And when we don't really test our own controls, we're constantly assuming that they would work and they would mitigate, detect, and protect us from the next attack. But in reality, um, we're not sure that that would actually happen. Now, if we look at Einstein, for example, and I quote him that in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. So the idea here is that in theory, our security controls should help us because we invested a lot of time, invested money, and we had this deployments. But in practice, how do we know if they're actually working the way we want them to work? How do we really know that they would stop tomorrow's attack? There's a lot of theories and assumptions that happen in cybersecurity. For example, vulnerability management. I mean, we all are running vulnerability management tools, and we basically see vulnerabilities. Um, we identify them, and then by kind of a CVSS score algorithm, we're trying to predict what kind of vulnerability would be the most detrimental to our organization. We don't really test these vulnerabilities. We don't really exploit the vulnerabilities and understand what will happen if an attacker comes in. So what we're playing with is a lot of assumptions in cybersecurity that if we do this, that will happen. And there's many, many assumptions that we do. Um, but in essence, in order to avoid all these assumptions, in order to really understand what is the state of our controls, what is our state of our cybersecurity, we have to adopt the attacker mindset. And this is what kind of we in Pentera believe in. Now, the attacker mindset is not just one thing. It's not just, oh, I have a vulnerability, let's see if I can exploit it or not. An attacker goes through a journey, a sequence of events, right? From the first point of entry to bypassing the controls, sniffing credentials, cracking passwords, lateral movement, privilege escalation. There's a sequence of events that happen once an attacker steps in to my environment until they reach their kind of like treasure. And as you can see here, the treasure map on the right. So it's a journey. An attacker goes through a journey. So in order for us to understand how our controls are reacting, how our cybersecurity resilience is, and what kind of places we need to focus on, we need to emulate that journey. We need to adopt the attacker's mindset. I'm going to move to Shaq to talk a little bit about the few entry points of a ransomware attack.
Great. Thanks, Oren, for that. Yeah, and good morning, everybody. Great to have you all join us. So to bring it to life, looking at a real world example, we've seen a lot of these, over the last year and beyond. Typical attack vectors, right? Those entry points from a ransomware perspective, and I think a good example of that from last year, 8th of September. It was actually on a Saturday. The MGM resorts were compromised through a ransomware attack. So we had a couple of threat actor angles. One was using the Black Cat ransomware campaign as part of, and I'm trying to think, Scattered Spider was the threat actor. So this happened on a Saturday, which is really interesting from a threat actor perspective in that they targeted. I have a high value account. So a lot of these threat actors are looking at targeting existing users. Maybe they've got stolen credentials, right? They've got some sort of access. They may use RDP, VPN-based credentials. All of these at some point may have been breached through an info stealer or a third-party breach, whatever the case might be. And we know that a lot of users tend to reuse passwords. That gives them a threat actor some sort of initial access. In this case, let's say it was a smishing or a SMS text that was used to phish the attacker, and they were a global Okta admin, which was significant, right? Because that was a high value target. Once a compromise happened and the attacker was inside the network, right? The world is open to them. A global Okta admin means that they've got access to multiple systems. They've got the ability now to move laterally, and something that a Scattered Spider is infamous for is lateral movement. And this is interesting for us, right? Because we're not just talking about theoretical. We're not, as Oren mentioned, we're not talking about a simulation. We're talking about really replicating real world adversary behavior. And so in the same fashion, that lateral movement allows us to look for interesting targets. What's an interesting target? Right. And we'll see that later on in the demo, right? We're looking for some sort of data effectively that we could encrypt on the file system and hold the victim to ransom. There are multiple levels of let's say, extortion when it comes to ransomware: victim data, end user and customer data, supplier data. All of those are up for grabs. But that kind of gives you, an idea of, like, we are relating this to the real world. And then if you just jump to the next slide, Oren, I think it's just the time for the demo. So let's jump straight into the Pentera platform. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and you should be able to see that now. Awesome. Right, so there are a number of different scenarios within the Pentera platform. And the one we're going to talk about today is a targeted test that allows us to emulate a ransomware attack. We have other scenarios that allow us to understand that resilience from an attacker perspective. And as we talk about that, cybersecurity program, it's really about continuous improvement. It's about finding the gaps, identifying them quickly, and being able to fix them. But starting with the targeted testing, we really want to go in and emulate a ransomware attack. Now, it takes a few minutes, less than 5, I would say, to set up a particular scenario. I'm not going to go through all of the sort of configuration just now, because I want to show you the crown jewels, right? Or I guess the eye candy of what Pentera can show in terms of visualizing the attack. And when we go into things like the attack vector, it's important to note that a lot of attacks, as we saw in the previous example, right, real world example, it's not a single vulnerability. It's not a single configuration, or let's say a set of credentials that are the downfall. It's a chain of events that escalate or snowball into something like a successful ransomware attack. And in this case, in this example that we see in the demo environment, we can see 3 devices where we successfully propagated the ransomware attack kill chain. And we get a level 10 achievement. That's the highest achievement that we can get. By the way, love to keep this interactive. Please feel free and jump in with any questions. If anything doesn't make sense or anything you'd like me to drill into a little bit more, happy to do that. We have time. And so looking at all of these vulnerabilities, everything with a broken shield icon represents some sort of vulnerability. And we have, like we said, a chaining of multiple events or vulnerabilities that provide us with some sort of achievement. Achievements we can see over here on the left-hand side, right? And they are paired with some of these vulnerabilities. So starting at the top, right at the beginning, very common attack vector. It's a low-level CVSS score, 4.7. You wouldn't expect that, but this is kind of a root cause that has allowed us to capture credentials over the network. Now, when we start to replicate TTPs, especially from a MITRE attack perspective, there are a lot of different ways for us to capture credentials, or do man-in-the-middle attacks to capture those credentials. An example of that might be through IDP, right, where SSL isn't being enforced or broken in some way, and we've got plain text passwords going across the network, to NTLM hashes for different types of accounts, machine accounts, user accounts. Typically, any kind of threat actor is going to start looking for a way of being able to do privilege escalation through either a vulnerability or being able to use that to pivot to more high value accounts by doing some sort of reconnaissance on Active Directory. And that's exactly what we've done here, right? We've now relayed the attack over LDAP by abusing another vulnerability around SMB message signing, which usually says that ideally, in an ideal situation, we should be enforcing all communication over SMB. But if you're not, it's very easy now for the user to impersonate a machine account, a regular user account, pivot to Active Directory, right? And that Active Directory could be a hybrid environment where you are syncing with Azure or Entra ID. But in this case, we've now enumerated all of those users. And what are we going to do as a threat actor? The first thing that happens is we're going to pivot to Active Directory and we're going to find high value accounts. So this is absolutely something that we see in the real world. And we've then pivoted very quickly to an ASP rep roasting attack. An ASP rep roasting attack now allows us to take the Kerberos hash because it's been misconfigured. So another vulnerability that's allowed us to find a high value account called Veritas. It's a privileged account, and it has privileges across multiple devices. More importantly, we're going to take that Kerberos hash and we're going to pass it to the cracking engine. So under the hood, Pentera has a number of different attack tools that allow us to be able to do different things. One of them is being able to crack passwords. In this case, it's actually a really easy password, right? So anything that represents a dictionary word or a common phrase means that we can try and crack that password in 1.5 seconds, in fact, for this particular one. Now, Pentera does all of the hard lifting because it will look for all the permutations. We'll also use things like distance matching, especially if those credentials can be, let's say, attributed to some sort of breach or leak. So, like we said, compromised, stolen credentials. Pentera will actually pull those in to your environment and test your existing accounts and anything that we find to see if there is a close match or something very similar. It doesn't have to be an exact match. And that's the smart thing, right? Because attackers are always going to look for credentials that might have changed slightly, but represent something that's known to them already. In this case, we validate those credentials to make sure that they're real. That validation means that we know that we can use these credentials to try and spin off other attacks. And in this case, it has privileges across all of the devices that we've discovered in this subnet. Remember, we have not installed any agents. We have not deployed any additional software, and other than the Pentera main node. So as a server, Pentera sits in your network, behaving like a trusted device. But in this case, that trusted device is compromised or behaving like a compromised device, but it's under your control. And that's important, right? Because now you can start to build out these, or allow Pentera to build out these attack vectors and help you visualize the attack as it happens in real time. In this case, we found some interesting data, right? We've now created, I like to call it a sandbox. We take a copy of any interesting data. So we're, again, not touching real data, but a copy of that data to see if we can encrypt it. If we're successful with the encryption, we'll move on to all of the other stages that represent this family of ransomware. Now, it could be Lockbit, it could be Maze, it could be REvil. There are a number of different campaigns that we have in the platform. Pentera updates it with new TTPs, new, let's say, IOCs, all of that kind of information. We're also looking at new ransomware campaigns and add them into Pentera. So there is a future update coming with some iterations around Lockbit and other ransomware campaigns. But the important thing is that we were successful in this particular emulation where we completed the ransomware kill chain. We went through various other stages around manipulating shadow copy. Again, we're not actually deleting shadow copy, we're testing if we can. And the AV failed, right? So any kind of anti-ransomware capability in the platform is designed to look at all of these different attack vectors or stages of the attack and pick up that suspicious behavior. I can see a number of questions that have popped into the Q&A, so I'm just going to jump into that to see if anything that I need to answer. No, okay. We will share the presentation, I believe, and the recording as well afterwards, but I'll let the other guys touch on that. And so what we've got here is a completed ransomware kill chain, right? And with the ransomware kill chain, we can start to do some really interesting things. Now that we've been able to visualize this attack within your own environment, right? Remember, it's run by you. You are the practitioner. You are the operator. You've now been able to see all of the different stages that are propagated. And we can start to say, well, what if I was to fix this particular problem? I can simulate a fix and say, well, this 5.3 don't require pre-auth, right? Just an attribute setting for an SPN or a service account means that if we were to fix this problem, I've got a remediation wiki link here. And if I click into that remediation wiki, I've already got it preloaded here, it gives me detailed information about this misconfiguration. It's not a static vulnerability. It's not something that's tied to a CVE. It's just hardening within your environment. And sometimes attackers are going to abuse misconfiguration, things that haven't been hardened or configured properly, any kind of protocol or Windows security related issues. A lot of those things are usually done through configuring accounts in the right way or configuring policies. A lot of security in a Windows environment, let's say, is done through security. And it's really hard to maintain and monitor, and hence why it becomes important to test these on a regular basis. But in this case, we were successful with the ASP rep roasting attack because one of the accounts had the don't require pre-auth set. That pre-authentication allows us to be able to pull out the hash for the account and subsequently crack the password, and then led on to us being able to propagate the ransomware attack. Going back to the attack map, now for some reason, imagine this is a legacy issue or a legacy system. Certainly for this particular problem here, we might not be able to fix it. We may have a reliance on this particular protocol for name resolution, and so I can't fix that problem. But I could fix this weak password, right? And so from a mitigation perspective, let's say we go back to fixing the misconfigured account. I can actually see how it's disrupted the flow of the attack. It's prevented the ransomware attack. It's prevented the achievement, even though the EDR is broken. In this case, the EDR was broken because somebody disabled Windows Defender and they forgot to re-enable it. And this is a very common practice or problem that we see out in the field. Most of the time, it's not that your EDR is bad in any way. It's usually because it's badly configured. And so somebody was doing some testing, forgot to re-enable it. Or let's say in other instances, we've seen a misdeployment, right? Or a broken service, and now the EDR, the anti-ransomware capability, isn't working. Now, the other problems here, again, we might fix some of those as well. We might not be able to fix all of them. But let's say this weak password, I can fix this really easily, right? We know what the password is. It's a service account. It's a high value target. We need to fix that probably quite urgently. And again, it disrupts the flow of the attack. Eventually, I probably want to fix my EDR, right? And I probably want to fix this don't require pre-auth for my misconfigured account. I probably want to fix the SMB message signing. I might never get to fix this. But when we talk about defense in depth, we're essentially showing you what doors you can close. And if you can close as many of those doors as possible, that becomes really powerful. We can start to visualize the impact of that attack. And it's not just visualizing it. It's not, again, simulated. In this case, we're simulating it to show the fix. But in practice, you're now going to be able to follow all of the remediation advice from our wiki, which is context related to the attack vector. So whatever we discovered here, each of these items will have the underlying remediation work that you need to carry out. You go and fix as many of those as you can, and then rerun the test. And so the repeatability of the test becomes important, right? I can run this test again tomorrow, the day after, a week later, a month later. Has anything changed in the environment? And that's what we're worried about, right? Has something changed, or has a new attack vector appeared? Perhaps a new system has been introduced, or a new account was created, right? Or a new security control was added. All of these things are changing all the time, or changing at certain points in time. And we want to be able to measure that resilience and change and say, are we better or worse than yesterday? And so I'll just pause there for a second because I can see there is, okay, great. Yep. Can we automate the test to run courtesy and alert on findings? Absolutely. So the automation is a key part of this, right? Like we said at the beginning, we can set up a test in under 5 minutes. I'll show you how to do that, the automation piece, and then rerun or schedule that test on demand or scheduled as often as we like. Now, at the end of this test, right, I've got some really good findings, but we put all of that together in an aggregated list, right? So the reporting now includes a prioritization on all the things that we need to fix and the order in which we need to fix them. So the remediation priority really is going beyond the severity score. And we're saying, well, regardless of a 4.7 or a 5.8, we need to fix these 3 things perhaps first, because they allowed us to propagate a ransomware attack, right? So going beyond just the configuration or protocols, things like the weak password that we were able to crack for the service account. We do have some static vulnerabilities related to CVE, right? But we can now see how this is much more powerful because it's giving us a better picture of what an attack actually looks like, as opposed to here's a bunch of configuration or vulnerabilities that you need to fix without any kind of context, right? And it might be that in 9 out of 10 cases, we fail with the attack, right? Let's take something like Print Nightmare. We test it on 10 different machines. 9 of them block the attack because the EDR was working. On the 10th machine, the EDR for some reason wasn't able to detect it because it wasn't configured in the same way. Perhaps it was a server and the configuration was slightly different. Now, how do you detect those outliers, right? Going back to Pentera, it's about being able to look at that shadow configuration, those outliers that have drifted from the norm because somebody made a change or somebody made a decision for a certain policy to be applied, but it was never tested, right? And it might never get tested until you have a real ransomware attack. So this becomes really powerful again to be able to look into the future and understand how would an attack look like. I'm just going to quickly drop into the question. Okay, we're good on the questions. We'll have a look at all of the questions at the end as well, as Daniel mentioned. So we've got the reporting side that we've looked at. I probably just want to show you one other thing because we talked about the automation. How do you build the scenario? So in this case, I'm going to talk about the targeting test and talk about the ransomware emulation. Most of these tests are very similar in how you set them up, right? You set up a name and description, you set up a subnet or an IP range that you want to test. So in this case, I'm on a particular subnet. Great. Let me go and find everything that lives on this particular subnet. Pentera will automatically go and do the reconnaissance discovery. It will go and find the underlying assets that live in that subnet network. We'll provide some credentials to seed the attack because we're assuming breach. For ransomware, really, it's about the efficacy of your security controls and configuration. It's not saying that an attacker, how does an attacker get in? Because we know that at some point attackers will get in. It will happen. It's just a matter of time. We're saying, well, let's assume that that's happened and now test our environment against that breach. And we can pick a particular family of ransomware. So there is an update currently within Pentera where we've added new capabilities for Lockbit, looking at the newer versions, variants of that. We also have other campaigns that are coming in, but we can look at controlling the type of encryption that we carry out. We can even target specific extensions because we know a lot of different solutions to protect different files, different types of files, and different families of ransomware target different types of files. We also want to be able to approve each host that we're going to attack. So we don't automatically go and then run the attack on every machine that we discover. To give you an additional layer of control, you can approve the attack on each machine. And it's as simple as ticking a box when all of the devices are presented in the overview. And we can also emulate a exfiltration path, which means that we will go out to known IOCs, try and make a connection to an external system, a command and control server for that particular family of ransomware. We're not sharing any real data. So from a privacy point, there's nothing to worry about. We're just making an outbound connection that's sending benign data. We can also turn that off if we don't want to, or we can set up our own C2 server to exfiltrate to if we wanted to. And so from an automation point, I now have a template ready to go. I can schedule this on a weekly basis. And just like the MGM resorts, right? And say, well, let's actually try that, right? Or on a Saturday, see what our security looks like, because that's when security guys are mostly off, right? And that's when attackers like to run their attacks. So what does it actually look like on a Saturday against our internal environment? Now we're not just looking at the security gaps, we're also looking at your incident response. Do you get an alert in a timely fashion? Does it go to the right place, or is it going into a black hole? Do you have a third party that's monitoring those alerts? And are they on the ball on a Saturday or a Sunday or whatever day of the week it might be? And so we can then repeat those tests as often as we want, and we can set up a notification for the reports. I actually want those reports to go to my colleagues so that they've got visibility of what we discovered. And so we've now shifted all the time from setting up the test. And we know that it takes a long time to set up tests and run tests and organize those. And there's a lot of manual effort involved. And we've shifted that to the results, the output, because that's what we're really concerned about. And so when we look at the output from a reporting perspective, a couple of important things that come up. One is that we give you a resilience score. How did we do today compared to the last time that we ran the test? Are we better or worse? Have we made an improvement? And so, to be able to visualize that as a trend becomes really powerful because we can see changes that are being made in the environment and whether it's had any impact. In this particular environment, obviously the admin has been off for a long time, hasn't made any changes, but we'd expect a gradual improvement over time. And so what does that score actually mean? We break it down into a scorecard. We break down all of the individual elements that make up that criticality on that particular score, looking at things like account takeover, host takeover, lateral movement, just like we saw again in the MGM Resorts example, or any other example for that matter, around ransomware. Lateral movement to the crown jewels becomes important. In this case, we're actually not too bad, but we did still successfully carry out a ransomware attack on 3 devices based on the number of actions that we approved and the total actions that Pentera carried out. So this becomes a continuous program of improvement based on how you did the last time you ran the test. And we break down all of the different vulnerabilities that we tested for, whether we found them, right? Remember, Pentera is going way beyond just CVEs. We're looking at configuration, passwords, security controls, the ability of those security controls to alert and respond as well. And we break down each of those sections. So we give you detailed information about the underlying hosts, and we also talk about any kind of other additional things that we found that were interesting. Any kind of high value accounts are important. We want to make sure that those are locked down sufficiently. And then we've got the prioritization around the order in which we need to fix things. Each of these items has an underlying remediation detailing what needs to be fixed, how it needs to be fixed, and how we used it to leverage the attack. So you've got that remediation priority that becomes important. And one other thing that I want to show is the MITRE. This is also included in the report, but I want to show it in this view because I can do some interactive stuff. And we've now got a heat map of all of the techniques that we propagated in this particular scenario. So we have a lot of security controls that perhaps help us in a certain area, right? Think of these as different silos within your security control stack, from that sort of initial access to execution, right, around vulnerabilities, or your EDR or solutions or security controls or anything that's monitoring network traffic. So we talk about defense evasion. Where were we successful from a criticality point? And actually, I can filter this to look at the criticals and the highs and say, well, we have a particular problem around defense evasion and credential access. There's actually a lot of different techniques that are associated with that. And remember, this is dynamic. It's changing all the time. And Pentera, from a research perspective, is involved actively with helping MITRE to look at new techniques. We've actually submitted many of our own TTPs around what we've seen to MITRE. So we know that there's a continuous change there. But for us, from a roadmap perspective, from a security program perspective, right, we've got the operational view of what things look like today. But from a strategic point, long-term view, are we seeing a consistent problem around credentials and lateral movement? If we are, let's start to evaluate changes with our security control stack. Perhaps as a use case, we want to do a tech bake-off against, I don't know, network segmentation tools or a new EDR solution. How does that perform compared to what we have today? So we can start making real fundamental changes at a strategic level and try and see what the impact is. Are we better or worse compared to what we were yesterday? And that becomes really powerful. Just pause there for a moment. I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about in this particular webinar. I'm just going to have a quick look at any questions. So can we automate the test to run? Yep, we've gone to that one. Can we create tests according to the MITRE attack framework to identify environment weaknesses across the kill chain? So important thing to mention about the MITRE attack framework is that when we start to visualize an attack, we can actually do an overlay of MITRE, right? So we can look at specific techniques here and we can drill into them so we can see what techniques were used at a certain stage of the attack. Now, when we talk about threat actors, the important adversaries, the important thing is that these are shared eventually, right, across all threat actors. And so for us, it's really about helping you from an operational point understand your attack surface today. It's changing all the time, and techniques are being borrowed by different threat actors, being used by different threat actors all the time. We're helping you just look at your security stack more holistically and see how it stands up, right? Theoretically, right, you may be protected against domain reconnaissance, right? Let's say there's a SAM RPC issue where we can anonymously query Active Directory, right? But that server has been shut down, right? Because it's vulnerable, it can't be updated or patched or configured. And so we can no longer anonymously, sorry, can't say the word today, query that particular server. But the problem is that somebody switched that server back on. So, what's assumed is that we are now no longer vulnerable to that server, but a legacy server, after a year, somebody switched it back on and it suddenly makes you vulnerable. And we've seen that and things like that, shadow IT, misconfigured system all the time. So we're not really about, replicating specific adversary behavior. We're going to look at your entire landscape against all of the possible attacks. And remember, there is no effort on your side. Pentera is automating this test and then showing you the results. You go and do your day job, come back to the output, the results, and look at the prioritization of things that need to be fixed. And it's very important to think about the outliers. Anything else from anybody else? I think we might have covered everything. I've not scanned through all of the questions, but I will have a look in a minute. If there is anything else, any follow-ups, please let us know. Otherwise, I will hand it back to Oren.
Thank you so much, Jack. Really, really amazing way to showcase the ransomware attack. So just to pretty much wrap everything up, remove assumptions. Always test your controls, test yourself. Pentera has developed a one-of-a-kind ransomware framework to really test all the controls by emulating the ransomware campaigns, whether it's Lockbit, Maze, REvil, Conti, and others. It allows you to really test your own controls, starting from your prevention platforms to your detection platforms and so on. You can test everything in one go. Like you won't go on an airplane without knowing that it was tested. Do the same thing. Treat the same way to your environment. Everything's aligned to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it's pretty much designed for safety. The idea here is to help you continuously automate the testing in scale and do this in a consistent way. All right, so I'm gonna pass it to Daniel to wrap things up. Daniel, floor is yours.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you, Shaq. A great presentation and fantastic demo. It's really interesting to see the functionality and the capability of that particular tool. I've got a number of questions I'd like to go through here, really just to give a holistic and comprehensive understanding of the theme and the topic, but also Pentera's capabilities. So the first one that's top of mind for me is how is Pentera different to other manual pen testing tools? What are the sort of key differences that you see?
Oren, do you want to take that, or I'm happy we can both chip in, I guess.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's very similar to what I've said that in many cases, what we've seen, manual pen testers, they test only, a small portion of the network, as opposed to testing everything. Very similar to the analogy of an airplane, where you just test the landing gear as opposed to testing everything. Or another things that we see that instead of testing everything, they say, okay, I tested that VLAN and it's basically a golden image, so all the rest are the same. So it's very similar to my analogy on testing one aircraft and pretty much assuming that all the rest of the aircrafts are fine. So manual pen testing is great. It just lacks automation and lacks consistency because you really rely on the talent of the individual. And in many cases, it lacks the scale because, it just takes a long, long time. There's a lot of mundane things that you need to run through in order to test the entire environment. So I think when you introduce automation into manual pen testing, this is how you can really continuously test and adhere to the constant changes in the network that happen in your testing.
Yep. I can add a little bit to that as well. Think of the automation with what Pentera does as a force multiplier for anybody that is involved in manual pen testing. And we're certainly not a panacea for all types of testing. There is still a need to do things like social engineering, to be able to look at niche environments that might have OT and all those things. Some of those could be dangerous to automate and test at scale. But what we're looking at is the vast majority of that infrastructure piece, right? Whether that's on-prem, external, or cloud. So we cover all of those different attack surfaces, and we can automate on a regular basis, which means that we're going to find all of those things very quickly, and then allow the human expertise to look at the results and help with the remediation, the prioritization. And that's where you want to spend most of your time, your effort, right, on the remediation. And you probably want
Yeah.
to the niche use cases. So we're not certainly not replacing manual pen testing. We're really empowering them to be able to do a lot more. And this is a big disruptor, as I see it in the industry, right, to be able to scale to a level that they weren't able to before.
No, so it's a really good point. I think one of the key sort of risks we see at the ISF when our members are considering pen testing or sort of automation in this space is, are there any risks to the live infrastructure that you're testing? Or is this something that can tick along in the background and gather information with no risk to that infrastructure?
Yeah. So safety is a key part of what Pentera is about, is kind of our central ethos. We call it, we talk about safety by design, in that
Mm,
we're not doing anything malicious, we're not doing anything destructive, we're not impacting end users. Our research teams spend a lot of time developing the platform, the attack vectors, to make sure that they can run safely. Nearly all of our customers run Pentera in production. So they have that safety in mind, that they know that we're not going to do anything untoward. Now, there are, I guess, the elements that we talked about, right, like OT, DDoS, all of those kind of things still need to be planned by a human expert. But the large majority of stuff that we can test, or the large majority of things that that can be tested,
yeah,
can be automated, right? And we can test it safely.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Now, I mean, you've been talking about automation quite a lot, and one of the questions that I wanted to cover was how often can you and should you run these ransomware tests? Or is this something that is a continuous assurance activity?
Yeah, I would say it's all about your testing cycle and remediation. So the remediation cycle is, imagine that we find a half a dozen things that need to be fixed in a particular network. And it may take a week, it may take a couple of days, it may take a month. Every organization is different. And it's really about how quickly it will take for them to fix the problem. An important part to mention here is, partner isn't, sorry, Pentera isn't just a platform, it's also a partnership. And that partnership means that we actually have what we call security validation advisory teams, or red teamers, that
Mm,
will help the organization build out their testing program, and and interpret the remediation. So it really depends on how quickly certain things can be fixed or mitigated, and then repeat the cycle. So it could be done as often as once a day. You may
mm,
rotate that testing to different parts of your network every day. I think obviously the larger the enterprise, the more often they're going to be testing different parts of their network and remediating, and the bigger the team is to help with the remediation.
yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, I think I've got a sort of a wider question really, and this is about sort of where do you start with this, because I assume we've got audience members with a variety of maturity levels, and some of the audience will be thinking, are we ready to invest in something like this? Is there a level of readiness that you need to meet in order to make the next step, or is this open to everyone?
I'll take that, Shaq. Maybe let me start. So we see different customers. Some of them have I mean, maturity. They're very mature customers with a lot of security controls, and some of them are just starting out. The concept is when you run Pentero, you really know where you need to focus. So it really helps customers in both kind of sides of the pendulum. On the first, the mature prospects that have already 40, 50 controls in place, they want to validate, they want to understand what's working, what's not working, where should I invest? And customers are just starting, building the network, building it in a better way, have this automation in place of testing themselves will bring them to much better readiness when it comes to cybersecurity maturity, and will allow them to build their kind of strategy in the best way. So we basically fit both. In many cases, it happens a lot when I meet customers say, "Oh, I don't have anything. Why should I'm still just starting. Why should I, go with a pen testing platform right now? It feels like it's a much more mature solution." But it's not the case, because it's much better to have a solution that will constantly challenge you to understand what is working, what is not working, and how should I navigate into the cybersecurity landscape, because there's so many solutions out there. There's so many areas, niche areas. How do I know at the end what poses the biggest threat? I want to
Yeah.
know it right away. And this is why we always say, it doesn't really matter your maturity. You need to constantly test yourself.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I'm a big advocate of positioning the security function and the tools that support that function to enable the business to make better business decisions, and if you're identifying the key threats that can impact those assets and continuously doing that, then you'll definitely be in a better position to essentially detect, prevent any of those threats impacting you in the real world
Yeah.
moving forward.
We've seen a lot of different organizations at different maturity level that have all benefited. And I think, those that are thinking about, well, what security controls do we need to invest in for the future? So we have customers that are looking at network segmentation, looking at different EDR solutions, looking at micro segmentation, or even zero trust architecture. All of these things can, Pentera can be used as a way of being able to validate that change, that improvement over time, to see, well, is it effective? Have we configured it in the right way? Think of it as a bit like, if we talk about Formula One or pole position, right? If you're at the back, you obviously want to get to pole position. If you are in pole position, you want to be able to maintain that. So if you are of a certain maturity, you want to make sure that you stay at the front and you stay on top of things, because things are changing all the time. So I think it's relevant to anybody, depending, no matter where they are on the grid.
Absolutely. Now, with these webinars, I normally give a sort of a final opportunity for the speakers to summarize. Now, I mean, if I'll start with you, Oren. If you were to sort of summarize or translate some of the content we've seen today into a business case, what would be the major themes that jump out to you?
So I think, first of all, talking about pen testing is something you have to do. All right. If 5, 10 years ago people would kind of ignore it, today it's mandatory, and not from a regulatory perspective. It's basically for you to know that you're safe, to know that the attackers can't really do anything. Now, bringing a pen testing team, it's a lot of work, right? You need to find a team, hire them, give them a place. 3 weeks they're there. It's a lot of money. Each and every session of a pen testing team will cost a lot of money. And like we said, the nature of the IT environment today is it's very dynamic. What you have today might not be tomorrow, right? What the changes that happen, they happen so frequent, sometimes on an hourly basis. So you need to test more frequently. You need to test more frequently. So basically, from a business case perspective, instead of hiring pen testers that would do a very, let's say, a work that would not be sufficient to really look at the entire network, help them with automation. Take control to your own hands instead of relying on others.
Thank you, Oren. And Shaq, any final comments from yourself?
Yeah, I would say so. Somebody just mentioned about JISEC as well, and I'm sure Oren's going to touch on that. I would say the important thing is that Pentera is really easy to use. It is a platform that's designed for, IT teams, security teams, but it resonates with lots of different people that are involved in cybersecurity these days. Network people, vulnerability people, even to the sort of management level. Everybody has an interest in doing better cybersecurity, right? Having better resilience against an attack. So there is a very low bar to entry, and we also do a POV. Which lasts one day, right? So it's really easy. It's very frictionless in terms of showcasing the platform, and getting some hands-on experience with the platform. So, it's all good and well seeing it in a demo, but when you get to see it live in your own environment, it brings it to life. And I really encourage anybody that has an interest to see, how it would operate, how they would use it in their environment, what kind of use cases we can touch on. Give us a shout.
Mm, wonderful. And yeah, of course, I can see on the screen the reference to JISEC. So, Oren, would you like to maybe touch on that before we close?
Yeah, so really brief. We invite all of you to meet us at the Sugar Rush. I mean, that's the Sugar Rush experience. Every year we come up with new and innovative ideas for an experience you won't forget. So would love to meet you in our booth in Hall 8, booth B20. We're going to talk about our new cloud launch of a solution that does pen testing on the cloud. We're going to talk about any ransomware framework that you just mentioned. Feel free to come in and basically, I mean, see us in person, have the ability to ask questions, and then go more in depth in case you guys want to. And if not, feel free to reach out for us for any, POV, proof of concept, proof of value that we can run in your environment. We do it free of charge, just to see how Pentera reacts, how Pentera actually works in your environment in a small scale, so you can really see whether this solution is right for you. So we'd love to see you all there.
I've just noticed there's a lot of candy there as well.
A lot. We need to give it away, so please.
Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you so much for your presentations today and for the overviews and demos. And thank you to the audience for attending. We really appreciate your support. Of course, pay Pentera a visit at JISEC and explore their website. Myself, very much looking forward to meeting many of you at the Security Middle East Magazine conference next month. And please do get in contact if you want to get involved. So thank you everyone for your time. Thank you to the speakers, and we look forward to seeing you next time in the Security Middle East Magazine webinars.